Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take the latest stack of research, history, and raw science and condense it into the knowledge you need to navigate a complex world.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are opening the book on one of the greatest mysteries of prehistory. We're traveling back in time, barely 11,700 years ago, to a world that, quite frankly, would look completely alien if you drove through it today.
Oh, absolutely. A planet defined by giants.
Yeah, giants.
So it's often easy to forget just how close we are to that period.
Hmm.
The great naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, he said that the modern world, zoologically speaking, is impoverished compared to our recent past.
Impoverished, that's a strong word.
And he was right. I mean, imagine the Americas filled with over 20 species of mammals weighing more than 500 kilograms.
Wow.
Or think about Australia being patrolled by monitor lizards the size of small trucks. It's just a different reality.
That dramatic loss, that impoverishment, that's our focus today. We're undertaking a deep dive into the late quaternary extinction, or LQE.
Right. This huge global event starting around, 50,000 years ago?
Exactly. And it saw this staggering loss. I think the number is around 65% of all megafaunal species worldwide vanished.
And crucially, this wasn't just like a random die-off. It was incredibly specific, a sort of surgical removal of the largest, most ecologically influential animals on Earth.
Right. You mentioned that the defining characteristic of the LQE is its extreme and unprecedented size bias.
Yeah, exactly. The extinction selectively targeted animals typically weighing over 44 kilograms to about 100 pounds, while, the smaller species mostly sailed through the transition relatively unharmed. It's very peculiar.
So the central mystery we're trying to unpack here is the cause, right? We know this catastrophe coincided with two, seismic forces.
Yeah, two huge things happening at once. You've got the rapid climate change at the end of the last ice age.
Okay.
And you've got the global expansion of Homo sapiens, us, the novel, cooperative, and incredibly efficient new predator spreading across the planet.
So our mission today is to try and synthesize the science. Look at what was lost, why the debate over what caused it is still so intense.
Right, because it is intense.
And what these extinct giants can actually reveal about, the future of our own planet. Okay, so before we can really grapple with the scale of this loss, we probably need to establish who exactly we're talking about. The term megafauna gets thrown around a lot.
It does. It's crept into popular culture.
But scientifically, the definition seems a bit less clear-cut, doesn't it? How do scientists actually draw that line between just a large animal and a true giant?
Well, it's a really critical starting point, actually, because the definition you choose fundamentally shapes the narrative you construct about the extinction event itself.
Okay.
So the most straightforward method, and the one that drives most of these large-scale quantitative studies, is the mass-based threshold.
A weight limit, basically.
Exactly. This standard was famously set by the paleontologist Paul S. Martin. He put it at an adult body mass over 45 kilograms.
Which is roughly 100 pounds.
Right, about 100 pounds.
But why that specific number, 45 kilograms? It feels a bit, arbitrary.
It does seem that way, but it's actually quite functional, not philosophical. First, it's simple to apply. We can estimate body mass from skeletal remains relatively easily, across the fossil record.
Okay, practical for research.
Very practical. And second, 45 kilograms is roughly the weight of an average adult human hunter back then.
Ah, okay. So it relates to us.
Precisely. That proximity is critical for looking at causality because it helps identify the size class of animals that would have been, attractive, though maybe challenging, targets for early human foragers.
So it's the simple, measurable metric needed to document that stark size bias you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Shows who disappeared.
But I guess if we use just a purely mass-based metric, don't we risk kind of misrepresenting the true titans of the Pleistocene and maybe including animals that don't really feel like giants?
Yeah, that's absolutely the limitation. That 45-kilogram threshold is so inclusive. It sweeps up things like, certain large pigs or capybaras, maybe even large dogs. They technically qualify.
Right, not quite mammoth level.
Not quite. But then, on the other hand, if we restrict the definition to only the true titans, say maybe a weight threshold of 1,000 kilograms, that's 1 metric ton.
Okay, the really huge ones.
Yeah. Then we end up excluding classic, ecologically pivotal megafauna, like zebras or bison or large antelopes. And they certainly played a massive role in ecosystem dynamics.
So the mass-based approach is useful for asking maybe what proportion of large animals died. But it doesn't really tell us why their loss mattered so much ecologically.
That's a perfect way to put it. And that brings us to the second approach, the functional approach.
Okay.
Right, so the functional definition defines these animals by the role they actually played,
Right.
within the ecosystem's trophic structure, their job, basically.
Ah, like their function.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
And that view is, well, it's a much more powerful lens for predicting the ecological consequences, what happened when they disappeared. So we break them into guilds based on function, really regardless of their absolute weight sometimes.
Okay, so let's start with the mega herbivores then. These sound like the big plant eaters, the landscapers of the world.
They absolutely were. These are the real heavyweights, typically 1,000 kilograms and up. Think elephants, mammoths, certain giant rhinos.
Right.
Their defining feature, ecologically speaking, is that as adults, they're virtually immune to predation. Nobody messes with a full-grown mammoth.
Yeah, I wouldn't.
So this means their population stability is governed primarily from the bottom up. It depends on the availability and quality of their food source.
Okay.
They are the ultimate ecosystem engineers. They control biomass through just intense consumption, sometimes uprooting trees, constant trampling. They shape the place.
And their role is essentially to keep the world open, right? Preventing dense forests from just taking over everywhere.
Exactly. They maintain structural diversity. They create batchiness. Then, conversely, on the predatory side, you have the mega carnivores.
Bigger meat eaters.
Usually species exceeding 100 kilograms, like the saber-toothed cat we mentioned, or the American lion. They are the true apex predators.
So they regulate the herbivores from the top down.
Right. And crucially, they also regulate the smaller predators, the mesocarnivores, through something called intra-guild predation. Basically, big predators keep the medium predators in check.
Ah, interesting. So if you remove a megacarnivore,
You immediately destabilize the whole food web below them. Things can get out of whack pretty quickly.
what's really fascinating here, though, is this idea of functional flexibility you mentioned earlier, that the size needed to be mega is relative to the environment.
It's totally context dependent. I mean,
Sure.
think about it. On the African savanna today, a large flightless bird wouldn't really register as megafauna,
No, not compared to an elephant.
right? But on an isolated island, like, say, the extinct moa of New Zealand, or maybe a giant flightless goose on Madagascar, that animal might occupy the highest herbivore trophic level there. If it's large enough to be free from adult predation within that specific ecosystem, well, it's performing the exact ecological role a mammoth or an elephant would on a continent.
Even if it only weighs, say, 200 kilograms.
Exactly. It's the ecological power that defines them in this functional sense, not just the absolute weight measurement you might get in the lab.
Wow. Okay, that contrast between the continental titans and those island giants really drives home the kind of evolutionary richness we lost.
It's staggering.
So to really understand the scale of this tragedy, maybe we should take a quick global tour of this magnificent bestiary. Let's start in the Americas. This was a land of incredible evolutionary mixing, wasn't it? After the Great American Biotic Interchange.
Oh, the Americas were astonishingly diverse. A true melting pot of mammalian evolution, especially North America. You had this highly specialized suite of proboscideans, the elephant relatives, filling every conceivable niche.
Like the mammoths.
Right. The classic woolly mammoth, the famous one, who was actually a specialist of the cold tundra. Maybe shorter hair than pop culture suggests, but definitely fat insulated.
Yeah.
Then you had the larger Columbian mammoth, which preferred more temperate grasslands and forests. And the American mastodon, totally different lineage, recognizable by its sort of cone-shaped cheek teeth.
Right, for crushing wood.
Exactly. It was a dedicated forest dweller, browsing on trees and shrubs. The key thing is they weren't really directly competing for the same food sources. They partitioned the landscape.
And the predators that went along with these giants were just as imposing. We hear a lot about the saber-toothed cat, Smilodon fatalis.
Smilodon was formidable, absolutely. A really robust ambush predator with those famous specialized canines. But it wasn't the only terror out there. You also had the American lion, Panthera atrox.
Bigger than today's lions.
Oh, yeah. But 25% larger than a modern African lion. Might be the largest cat species ever to exist.
Wow.
And then there was the giant short-faced bear, Arctodus simus.
Okay, Arctodus simus. This creature sounds terrifyingly huge, reaching over 1,000 kilograms, standing 3.5 meters tall on its hind legs. Was it a hunter or more of a scavenger?
Ah, that's the big debate that keeps paleontologists busy. Its legs were exceptionally long and slender for a bear, and it had this large nasal cavity.
Suggesting.
Well, some think it was built for high-speed, long-distance pursuit. Others think it was for tracking carrion, smelling kills from miles away across vast territories.
So maybe both?
Could be. Its jaw was powerful, teeth could crush bone, so it could certainly kill. But many argue its immense size and speed made it a dominant kleptoparasite.
A kleptoparasite, like a thief.
Exactly. A terrifying creature that would just run in, chase off a smaller predator like a dire wolf pack from their kill, and just steal it. Its sheer presence must have defined the competitive landscape of the Pleistocene.
Okay, let's head down to South America. The picture shifts entirely there, right? Because the fauna evolved in almost complete isolation for millions of years before that interchange connected the continents.
South America was, well, it was a land of bizarre endemic lineages, stuff unlike anything seen anywhere else. The true star, I think, has to be the giant ground sloth, Megatherium.
The size of an elephant.
Easily. And it could stand over 6 meters tall on its hind legs, using its massive tail like a tripod to browse high up into the tree canopy. Its presence fundamentally defined where the forest line was on that continent. Just incredible.
And you had armored tanks roaming around too, like the glyptodons?
Yes, the armored lineage that includes Dodoceras. This was a giant relative of the armadillo, protected by this huge domed carapace, almost 2 meters across.
Wow.
And equipped with a spiked, bony tail club that looked like something out of medieval warfare. A mace tail. These were true evolutionary dead ends, totally unique to South America.
Amazing.
And we can't forget the really strange ungulate macrochenia. It looked a bit camel-like, but its nasal opening was retracted high on its skull.
Which strongly suggests...
It probably had a short, flexible trunk, like a tapir's maybe,
Yeah.
making it this entirely unique browsing machine with no modern parallel at all. It's really hard to look at that whole bestiary and not feel this profound sense of loss.
Definitely. Okay, let's jump across the globe to Eurasia. Here, the defining feature seems to have been this vast, expansive mammoth steppe.
The mammoth steppe, yeah. It was a unique biome, this huge, cold, but surprisingly productive arid grassland. It stretched all the way from modern-day Spain across Siberia and even into Alaska during the glacial periods.
And the immense fauna there was supported by the sheer productivity of the ground cover itself.
That's right.
We often assume cold environments are unproductive, right? Like frozen deserts. But the steppe was this big exception. Why was it so productive?
Well, it was kind of a perfect storm of environmental factors. The climate was arid, which meant heavy snow didn't really accumulate deeply. Instead, you got light, wind-scoured snow.
Allowing animals to get to the food?
Exactly. They could access the forage year-round. And critically, the intense grazing and trampling by the animals themselves prevented deep-rooting mosses and woody shrubs from dominating.
So the animals maintained their own food source, in a way.
In a very real way. This constant disturbance maintained a diverse mix of high-protein grasses, sedges, and these nutrient-rich flowering plants called forbs. This ecosystem was effectively an Arctic biomass factory. It supported incredible densities of grazers.
And who made up that classic lineup on the steppe?
Oh, the lineup was iconic. You had the woolly mammoth, of course, the heavily furred woolly rhinoceros, formidable herds of steppe bison, and the giant, majestic Irish elk, Megaloceros giganteus.
With those enormous antlers.
Those antlers, spanning up to 3.6 meters, just incredible. And they weren't just for show. They required massive amounts of nutrients and energy to grow each year. That alone proves how good the quality of the forage must have been in that steppe environment.
And the predators supporting this huge biomass. Like the cave lion.
The cave lion, Panthera spelaea, yeah. It was a highly successful subspecies, actually larger and more robust than modern African lions, a top predator.
Okay.
But a surprising giant found here was the cave bear, Ursus spelaeus. Although it was enormous and often found in the same caves as human artifacts.
People assume it was a fearsome predator.
Right. But meticulous analysis of its skull and teeth, which were really adapted for grinding, shows it was overwhelmingly herbivorous.
Really? A giant vegetarian bear.
Pretty much, specialized in a diet of roots, berries, grasses. It was a gentle, though truly gigantic, herbivore, not really a primary predator like the lions.
Fascinating. Okay, finally, let's turn to Australia, or Sahul as it was connected then. A world defined by isolation and marsupials.
Sahul's long isolation meant its megafauna evolved along radically different lines from the rest of the world. The largest marsupial ever known was Diprotodon optatum.
What was that like?
Imagine a lumbering rhino-sized creature, but distantly related to modern wombats. Just huge. You also had other marsupial giants, like the giant short-faced kangaroo, Pocoptodon goliah. Its legs were so robust and thick.
That suggests...
Well, some biomechanical studies suggest it may have moved with a sort of bipedal walking gait rather than the hopping locomotion we associate with kangaroos today. striding across the landscape.
A walking giant kangaroo. And the apex predator there was something else entirely, right? Not a mammal.
Indeed. Well, Australia did have the marsupial lion, Thylacoleo carnifex, which is a specialized, powerful predator with these unique shearing teeth.
Yeah.
The undisputed largest predator in Australia was actually a reptile, Megalania, or Varanus priscus.
A giant monitor lizard.
Giant monitor lizard,
Uh,
potentially reaching 7 meters in length and weighing over 600 kilograms, like a Komodo dragon on super steroids.
Good grief.
So the survival of other megafauna on this continent depended partly on evading this almost dinosaur-like reptile. It just illustrates how profoundly different the ecological structure was compared to the rest of the world.
Okay, taking that global census really gives us an appreciation for the sheer zoological richness that just disappeared.
It's mind-boggling.
So now let's move to the core functional issue. What did their loss actually do? The key insight here seems to be that the megafauna weren't just large tenants of the environment. They were powerful, dynamic forces, the undisputed ecosystem engineers.
Absolutely. They were the maintenance crew, you could say. And their tools were their teeth, their hooves, and just their sheer mass. Because they had such immense metabolic needs, these megaherbivores profoundly influenced vegetation structure.
How so?
Through intense browsing, grazing, and physical disturbance, like breaking branches, pushing over saplings, trampling vegetation, they actively suppressed the growth of woody plants. They kept things in check.
So this maintained a kind of ecological instability or diversity that was actually beneficial for overall biodiversity, right?
Exactly. That constant disturbance was essential to maintain open, diverse, mosaic landscapes. Think areas interspersed with grassland, scrub, and pockets of woodland. This variety allows lots of smaller species to flourish in the different patches.
And when they disappeared.
Well, the disappearance of this top-down control fundamentally altered biomes globally. We saw the vast open mammoth steppe, which, as we said, required constant grazing to suppress moss and shrubs. It rapidly converted into the less productive, less diverse tundra and taiga forests we know today.
Simply because the engineers were gone.
The engineers blocked out, yeah.
Wow. Okay. Beyond physically shaping the vegetation, they also acted as critical biological delivery systems for essential nutrients. This is the concept of the lateral nutrient pump.
This is one of the most profound yet often overlooked services they provided. It's about biogeochemical cycling on a continental scale. You see, all ecosystems naturally suffer from nutrient leaching. Rain washes essential elements like phosphorus and nitrogen downhill out of the soils and eventually out to sea.
Right. Nutrients get lost over time.
But large migratory animals actually counteracted this process.
How did they manage to reverse nutrient loss? That sounds almost impossible.
Well, they functioned as mobile pumps. During their vast migrations, they'd consume nutrient-rich vegetation in concentrated patches, often down in valley bottoms or on floodplains where nutrients accumulate.
Okay.
And then they'd walk elsewhere, maybe uphill, maybe across vast distances, and deposit those concentrated nutrients via their feces and urine in nutrient-poor uplands or other areas during their seasonal movements. Their vast movements redistributed fertility across the landscape.
So they were essentially ferrying fertilizer across continents.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And at a scale that no small animal could ever possibly match. The fossil record suggests some Pleistocene giants undertook migrations covering thousands of kilometers.
Incredible.
So when the megafauna vanished, the efficiency of this lateral nutrient pump is estimated to have just plummeted by over 90% in some calculations.
90%.
90%. And we can arguably see the lasting impact of this even today in regions like the Amazon basin, where soil fertility remains really patchy and generally lower in the uplands compared to regions in, say, Africa that still have extant megafauna doing this job, albeit on a smaller scale.
Wow. And then we have the evolutionary anachronisms, these living fossils that are lasting, tangible proof that coevolutionary relationships were just severed.
These are the biological ghosts of the Pleistocene past, lingering in our modern world. Many plants evolved large, flecky, tough fruits, specifically to be consumed and then dispersed by extinct megaherbivores. It's a mechanism scientists call the megafaunal dispersal syndrome.
Like what kind of plants?
Well, think of the avocado in the Americas, or the tough, large pods of the honey locust tree, or the bizarre Osage orange, which produces these big, bumpy fruits that are way too large and hard for most modern North American mammals to eat and disperse effectively.
So these fruits just rot on the ground now?
Largely, yes. Or they rely on much less efficient dispersal by water or gravity. And consider the formidable thorns covering the branches of the honey locust, for example. They only really make evolutionary sense as a defense against a multi-ton, large-mouthed browser like a ground sloth or a gomphothere there.
Not against a modern deer.
Exactly. A deer just walks around them. These are plants still waiting for their partners to come back.
That's powerful context. Let's look at a really fascinating case study concerning vulnerability, the woolly mammoth. What did those genomic studies of their remains reveal about their social behavior and maybe why they might have been preferentially hunted?
Right, this was a great study. They analyzed the DNA from the remains of 98 mammoth specimens that were found in natural traps, things like bogs, sinkholes, crevasses, places where animals accidentally died.
Okay, and what do they find?
They discovered a really significant overrepresentation of males in these accidental death sites. Almost 70% of the trapped mammoths were male.
70%? Why would males be so much more prone to accidents?
Well, it connects directly to what we know about modern elephant, or proboscidean social structure. Modern elephants live in these tight-knit matriarchal herds. They're led by the oldest, most experienced females.
Right, the matriarchs hold the knowledge.
Exactly. Their collective knowledge of water sources, seasonal dangers, migration routes, it's absolutely crucial for the herd's survival. But young males, once they reach adolescence,
They leave the herd.
they disperse. They become solitary or form looser bachelor groups. They lack that deep, collective ecological wisdom held by the female-led herds.
So they're more likely to blunder into trouble.
Far more likely to fall into a hidden crevasse or get stuck wandering into a dangerous bog. This inherent behavioral vulnerability created a predictable weakness.
Which human hunters could exploit.
Precisely. Cooperative, intelligent human hunters could have easily recognized this pattern and preferentially targeted the more isolated, potentially less dangerous, accident-prone young males.
That's something concrete we seem to know about mammoths. But let's turn to Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, because here, the fundamental question of its social life seems to remain firmly in the realm of what we don't know.
Oh, this is one of the most contentious debates in paleoecology. Was Smilodon a social pack hunter, like a lion, or was it a solitary stalker, maybe more like a tiger?
What's the evidence for it being social?
Well, the primary evidence often cited comes from those high-abundance fossil traps, especially the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles. They found hundreds of Smilodon individuals there.
Suggesting maybe they hunted in groups and got trapped together?
That's one interpretation. But maybe the more compelling evidence, or at least the most debated, is the discovery of Smilodon fossils showing healed, catastrophic injuries.
Like what kind of injuries?
We're talking major fractures of the hip or the femur or severe bone infections like osteomyelitis, injuries that would have absolutely permanently incapacitated a solitary predator. It wouldn't be able to hunt.
So the argument is that for a predator to survive long enough, for a massive broken bone to fully knit back together, it must have been cared for, provisioned by a social group?
Exactly. Fed by its peers while it recovered. That's the inference. However, this interpretation is heavily challenged.
What are the counter-arguments?
Well, critics point out that the large numbers at La Brea could simply be an accumulation of thousands of solitary deaths over millennia. Individual cats drawn independently to the scent of trapped prey, then getting stuck themselves.
Okay.
Furthermore, anatomically, Smilodon had a relatively small brain case compared to modern highly social carnivores like lions. And there's other fossil evidence suggesting that even typically solitary predators like bears do occasionally survive seemingly life-threatening injuries on their own.
So the jury's still out?
Very much so. And the answer matters immensely, because if Smilodon hunted socially, it was a far greater competitive threat to early humans and other native predators than if it was primarily a solitary ambush hunter. We simply don't have definitive proof either way yet. It's a big unknown.
Okay, understanding the functional importance of these giants and the mysteries still surrounding them only deepens the puzzle of their rapid disappearance. We now arrive at the central conflict, the late Quaternary extinction. It coincided perfectly with two massive global changes.
Yep, the timing is uncanny. You have the end of the glacial cycle, huge, rapid climate change, and the global dispersal of the only true technological species on the planet, Homo sapiens. Us, spreading everywhere.
Right. And the debate remains intense, you said, because both single-cause hypotheses, climate or humans, have powerful evidence supporting them.
They do, but neither hypothesis on its own, fully explains why this particular climate transition was so catastrophic for megafauna compared to all the previous ones they survived.
Okay, let's break it down. Hypothesis 1, the overkill model, the anthropogenic cause. This is basically the argument that human hunters did it.
The overkill model, yeah. It was famously articulated by Paul S. Martin, often described in its most extreme form as the blitzkrieg hypothesis.
Blitzkrieg, like a lightning war.
Kind of. The core idea is that humans, armed with new, superior technology like projectile weapons, spear throwers, maybe bows, and using sophisticated cooperative hunting techniques, rapidly expanded into new continents, specifically Australia and the Americas.
And the megafauna there were predator naive.
Exactly. They hadn't co-evolved with this type of highly intelligent tool-using predator. They lacked the necessary fear responses, the avoidance strategies, the defensive mechanisms to deal with this entirely new kind of threat.
So what's the key evidence supporting overkill?
It's overwhelmingly chronological and geographic. The extinction dates for megafauna in these newly colonized areas like Australia and the Americas clustered incredibly tightly around the first widely accepted dates for human arrival in the archaeological record. The timing lines up almost perfectly.
And those differential extinction rates across continents are incredibly striking too, aren't they?
They provide perhaps the strongest quantitative argument for overkill. Look at Africa, the only continent where megafauna co-evolved alongside hominins for millions of years. Africa suffered the lowest extinction rate by far. Only around 21% of its megafauna species were lost during the LQE. Now compare that to the catastrophic losses in the newly colonized areas.
Where animals met humans for the first time.
Right, North America lost about 72% of its megafauna genera. South America lost even more. And Australia, a staggering 88% loss.
Wow, 88%.
This huge disparity strongly suggests that coevolution provided some kind of crucial resilience, some learned defenses that the Australian and American faunas completely lacked when they first encountered humans.
And we do have some direct archaeological evidence too, right? Like kill sites.
We do. There's evidence like the discovery of Clovis points these distinctive spear points that define a key widespread culture that expanded rapidly across the Americas around 13,000 years ago. And these points have been found directly associated with butchered mammoth remains and mastodons, other megafauna. There's also protein residue analysis on ancient stone tools showing they were used on extinct species.
Okay, so that sounds pretty convincing. But if the argument is overkill caused continental scale extinction, the evidence of the killing itself needs to be pretty widespread, right? And that seems to be where the hypothesis runs into some trouble.
It does. That's one of the major criticisms. The relative scarcity of unambiguous, widespread kill sites globally. Critics ask, can we really blame the continental scale extinction of dozens of species on just a few scattered butchery sites? Is that enough evidence? Furthermore, some critics cite optimal foraging theory from ecology. It basically suggests that focusing hunting efforts primarily on massive, dangerous, slow-reproducing prey like mammoths or giant sloths might have been highly inefficient and unnecessarily risky for small groups of early human foragers.
Compared to hunting smaller, faster reproducing game like deer or rabbits.
Exactly. Why risk your life tackling a mammoth when you can get more reliable protein from smaller, safer prey?
And the timeline itself, the neat Clovis coincidence, is now being challenged, isn't it?
Yes, that's a big one. The original blitzkrieg model really relied on the clean timing of the Clovis culture, being the first significant widespread human presence in the Americas. But now, there's mounting archaeological evidence from various sites suggesting human occupation in the Americas predates Clovis, perhaps by several millennia.
So if people were there earlier.
Right. If humans were present in the Americas for thousands of years before the main extinction pulse, why did the megafauna survive that initial period? It complicates the idea of a rapid, instantaneous collision between hunters and naive prey.
Okay. That leads us naturally to hypothesis 2, climate change. The argument that the giants simply couldn't keep pace with the massive environmental reorganization happening at the end of the Ice Age.
This hypothesis puts the blame squarely on the environment. It attributes the disaster to rapid warming, deglaciation, melting ice sheets, changing rainfall patterns, and the resulting fragmentation and outright loss of essential habitats and biomes.
And the evidence for massive climate change is undeniable.
Oh, irrefutable. We know, for example, that the vast, highly productive mammoth steppe biome, which sustained the densest biomass of large herbivores on the planet, essentially vanished. It disappeared relatively quickly.
And it was replaced by
far less productive, often closed canopy biomes like the taiga forests and mossy tundra that we see across much of Siberia and northern North America today.
So the argument here is basically that the giant food factory was shut down. The large animals that needed vast quantities of high-quality forage either starved or their populations became restricted to tiny, fragmented, unsustainable patches of suitable habitat.
Precisely. And this idea is supported by concepts like the Plaids and Stripes hypothesis, put forward by R. Dale Guthrie.
Plaids and stripes.
Yeah, he suggested the Pleistocene world, the Ice Age world, was ecologically a highly dynamic, unstable plaid world. Think rapidly shifting variable habitats across the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
In that kind of world, large body size and high mobility were massive adaptive advantages for tracking resources.
Right.
But the shift into the warm, relatively stable Holocene epoch, our current era, brought a more predictable, geographically zoned, striped world. Think distinct bands of vegetation running latitudinally.
And in this new stability.
Well, in this new stability, the very traits that made megafauna successful before, their slow reproduction rates, their long generation times, their vast dietary needs, suddenly became a fatal disadvantage. They couldn't adapt quickly enough.
Well, the climate-only theory has one central, almost unassailable rebuttal that keeps the debate fiercely alive. The problem of the prior interglacials.
That is the killer counterargument, yes. Paleoclimate records show that megafauna survived over 20 similar dramatic warming cycles and major environmental shifts before the last one, all throughout the Pleistocene.
Transitions that were just as rapid, just as profound as the one at the end.
Many of them were, yes. Yet, they only suffered this truly catastrophic, globally synchronized, highly size-biased mass extinction event during the very last transition.
And what was the one novel factor present only during this last transition that wasn't there during the previous 20?
The global expansion and presence of behaviorally modern Homo sapiens, us.
Oh, right.
This critical observation strongly suggests that climate change, while undoubtedly a major stressor, was likely insufficient on its own to cause this unique level and pattern of extinction. Something else was different this time.
Okay, so given the strengths and weaknesses of both the overkill and the climate-only sides, it seems the scientific community is now heavily leaning towards Hypothesis 3, synergistic models, the perfect storm theory.
This is definitely the emerging consensus, I'd say.
Yeah.
Moving away from seeking a single silver bullet culprit. The synergistic model suggests that climate change acted as the primary systemic stressor.
How so?
By fragmenting habitats, reducing the carrying capacity of landscapes, shrinking megafauna population sizes, maybe altering birth rates, and pushing these already low-density populations closer to the edge of viability, they were stressed.
And then humans arrived on the scene.
And then, the added novel pressure of human hunting, even if it was relatively low-level initially, or geographically localized, provided the final, fatal tipping point that pushed already vulnerable populations over the brink into extinction.
It's like the difference between a healthy ecosystem easily weathering a storm versus a severely weakened ecosystem suddenly encountering a new hyper-efficient predator it's never faced before.
Exactly. It's often framed using ideas like the trophic cascade model. Humans didn't just hunt herbivores. They likely acted as a uniquely intelligent super predator.
How would that destabilize things?
Well, this intense new pressure from humans could have forced native carnivores like dire wolves, American lions, saber-toothed to switch their prey preferences, maybe intensify competition among themselves, and put even more pressure on the remaining climate-stressed herbivore populations. It creates a cascading wave of negative effects. This synergy, this combination of pressures, seems the most plausible explanation for why this specific interglacial period was so uniquely deadly for the world's giants.
So the LQE wasn't merely a list of fascinating creatures that died out. It was the trigger for a profound planetary-scale state shift. The world is truly emptied, not just of species, but of critical functional processes. And that led to decades, even millennia, of ecological reorganization afterwards.
That's exactly right. Because the extinction was so incredibly size-selective, it effectively decapitated the global food web, removing the very largest components at the top and middle. We call the resulting process trophic downgrade.
Trophic downgrading.
And the ripple effects were dramatic and almost immediate in ecological time.
Okay, so what was one of the immediate ecological consequences of removing those top predators, the mega carnivores you mentioned, mesocarnivore release?
That's right. The disappearance of the real giants of predation, Smilodon, the American lion, the dire wolf in North America, cave lions in Eurasia, Thylacoleo in Australia, left these big vacant ecological niches at the top. So smaller, often more generalist predators, The mesocarnivores, think coyotes, foxes, pumas, maybe smaller felids, were suddenly freed from intense competition with and direct predation by those larger carnivores.
They didn't have the big guys keeping them in check anymore.
Exactly, and their populations subsequently exploded in many areas. This often led to increased pressure on smaller prey species, perhaps birds or rodents, that the original apex predators might have largely ignored. The whole dynamic shifted.
And we also see dramatic shifts in the vegetation structures across continents. In wetter areas, the disappearance of the great browsers led to something called the brown to green shift.
Yes. Think of the Pleistocene world, maintained by megaherbivores, as a brown world dominated by the consumers, the animals eating the plants.
Okay.
When those big consumers vanished, many ecosystems shifted to a green world, a world primarily limited by resources, where plant growth determines the structure. By removing that top-down control of intense browsing, trampling, and even seed destruction by megaherbivores, widespread forest infilling occurred.
So forests just started taking over.
Pretty much. Pollen records from lake sediments and peat bogs clearly document this state shift across continents. Vast areas that were once open, savanna, parkland, or steppe, rapidly reverted to dense, closed canopy forests and thickets. The environment fundamentally became more homogeneous, less patchy, and often less diverse at the landscape scale.
But conversely, in the drier environments, like much of Australia, the lack of grazers led to an alarming brown to black shift. What does that mean?
This is a crucial distinction, and it's tied directly to fire fuel loads. In arid and semi-arid zones, the loss of vast herds of large grazers like the diprotodon and those giant kangaroos in Australia meant that flammable vegetation didn't get eaten.
So grasses and dead plant matter just built up.
Right. Grasses, dead woody debris, what ecologists call fine fuels, were no longer consumed and trampled down or disturbed regularly. This accumulation created unprecedented fuel loads across huge areas,
Leading to predictable results.
catastrophic fire. Fire effectively replaced the missing megaherbivores as the dominant landscape disturbance mechanism. Paleoenvironmental evidence, like charcoal layers and sediments, shows a dramatic increase in the frequency and intensity of wildfires across much of Australia, coinciding pretty closely with the megafauna extinction.
And that fundamentally changed the landscape.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It altered soil composition, nutrient cycles, and often suppressed forest regeneration, locking the landscape into a more frequent cycle of intense fire and open scrubland.
Wow. And returning to those evolutionary anachronisms we talked about, the weird fruits, we need to stress that these aren't just curiosities. They're like living physical proof of the ecosystem's trauma, right?
Yeah.
The Osage orange is still out there, its fruit rotting on the ground, basically waiting for a giant sloth that's never coming back.
It's such a powerful visual reminder of a severed coevolutionary bond. The existence of plants like the Osage orange, the honey locust with its giant pods and thorns, the pawpaw, the American avocado, their mere survival today proves they got through the LQE bottleneck somehow. Yeah. But their often restricted, static modern ranges prove they are ecologically handicapped. They lack their primary, co-evolved dispersal agent, the giant sloths, the mastodon, the gomphothere there, whatever it was. Their continued survival today is often reliant on much less efficient secondary dispersers, like rodents or maybe water, or increasingly just humans planting them in gardens. They're relics.
Finally, the LQE was so massive in scale, it actually transcended local ecology. It became a geological event that measurably impacted the entire Earth system, even the climate itself.
Absolutely. It wasn't just biological. It had geophysical consequences. The mass disappearance of vast numbers of methane-producing megaherbivores.
There's their digestion, right?
Yes, from their digestive systems.
Yeah.
Animals like mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, bison herds numbering in the millions, they produced enormous quantities of methane. Their removal is estimated by some studies to have caused a significant measurable drop in atmospheric methane concentrations around the time of the LQE.
And methane is a potent greenhouse gas.
A very potent one. So this drop in methane is thought to have contributed to a small but detectable global cooling effect, perhaps somewhere between 0.08 and 0.2 degrees Celsius. The extinction literally cooled the planet slightly.
That's incredible. And the change in ground conditions, especially up in the Arctic, also played a role in the physical system.
Yes, particularly concerning permafrost. The constant presence of huge herds of megafauna, especially grazers like mammoths and bison on the Mammoth Steppe, maintained the cold structure of the Arctic ground in winter.
How?
Their constant trampling and grazing removed the insulating layer of fluffy snow cover. It compacted the snow. This allowed the intense winter cold to penetrate much deeper into the underlying permafrost, helping to keep it solidly frozen year after year.
So losing the animals meant the ground started to thaw more easily.
Exactly. The loss of that trampling action, coupled with the vegetation changes from grassland to shrubland or forest, which also alters insulation and reflectivity, albedo, allowed the ground surface to warm more readily in summer and retain more heat. The LQE triggered this profound state shift in planetary functioning. It really demonstrates the immense, often invisible role that large animals play in maintaining Earth's complex systems. Hashtag 610 tags, the modern remnant and future horizons.
So the world we inhabit today is really the diminished remnant of that richer Pleistocene world. The contrast is just astonishing when you think about it, and it places our modern conservation efforts in a really unique, deep historical context.
It really is the great diminishment. I mean, if we look specifically at the species weighing 1,000 kilograms or more, the true giants that were alive in the late Pleistocene,
Oh,
there were about 57 species globally.
okay. And how many survived?
Only 11 survived to the present day. And in entire regions, vast continents like the Americas and Australia, all mammals over 1,000 kilograms vanished completely, gone. They are functionally empty continents in terms of those supergiants.
And even where some species did survive, like the African elephant, the modern rhinoceros species, they're often existing at such reduced numbers and in such fragmented ranges that they can't really perform their historical ecological role effectively anymore.
That's the key point. Most remaining large mammal populations today are what ecologists often term functionally extinct. Their numbers are just too small, and their range is too restricted, usually due to human encroachment and habitat loss.
That they can't act as ecosystem engineers on a large scale.
Exactly. They can no longer maintain a diverse mosaic landscape across vast areas, or effectively run that lateral nutrient pump we talked about, or significantly control vegetation patterns continent-wide. The total biomass of large mammals in the modern Arctic, for instance, is estimated to be maybe 100 times lower than it was during the height of the mammoth steppe. It's an empty landscape by comparison.
And the threats they face today, poaching, habitat loss, climate change, these are just an accelerating continuation of the same kinds of human pressures that likely began back in the Pleistocene, aren't they?
In many ways, yes. It's the same story, just intensified with modern technology and population levels.
This deep historical context, understanding what was lost, has fueled one of the most radical and ambitious ideas in modern conservation, hasn't it? Something born directly from studying the LQE, Pleistocene rewilding.
Rewilding, yeah.
Yeah.
It represents a fundamental paradigm shift in conservation thinking for some people. It rejects the traditional idea of just preserving the current, often diminished snapshot of biodiversity. Instead, it actively seeks to restore lost ecological function from the deep past. And the primary way proposed to do this is by reintroducing extantly living ecological equivalents, or proxies, for the extinct giants into suitable environments where they've been missing.
Okay, proxies. Like using a related species to fill the gap. The most famous example of this has to be Pleistocene Park up in Siberia.
That's the flagship project, run by Sergei and Nikita Zimov. The goal is audacious. They're trying to use large, cold-adapted grazers that still exist today, things like Yakutian horses, muskoxen, reindeer, European bison, even yaks, to actively recreate the highly productive mammoth steppe ecosystem in northeastern Siberia.
So they're essentially treating the landscape itself as a system to be engineered back towards its Pleistocene state.
That's exactly the idea, using the animals as the tools to do it.
And there's a massive climate change objective tied into this rewilding effort too, isn't there? It's not just about biodiversity.
Absolutely. It's explicitly framed as a potential climate intervention strategy. The core hypothesis is that the combination of intense grazing by these reintroduced herbivores, plus their heavy trampling, especially in winter,
You'll do what the mammoths did.
will do what the mammoths and bison used to do. It will remove that thick insulating blanket of snow, compact it, break up the moss layer that also insulates. By doing this, they hope to allow the intense Siberian winter cold to penetrate much deeper into the soil.
Keeping the permafrost frozen. Keeping the vast, carbon-rich permafrost frozen solid and preventing the potential release of enormous quantities of trapped greenhouse gases like methane and CO2 as the Arctic continues to warm rapidly. This idea directly suggests the functional loss of the original megafauna is actually accelerating global warming today by allowing permafrost to thaw faster.
Wow. Okay. Taking this concept even further, beyond using living proxies and heading almost into science fiction territory, is the highly controversial concept of de-extinction.
De-extinction, yeah. This aims to use advanced biotechnology, primarily genetic engineering, to actually resurrect extinct species.
And the poster child for this is, inevitably, the woolly mammoth.
Predictably, yes. The scientific plan, spearheaded by companies like Colossal Biosciences, involves using powerful gene editing tools like CRISPR
Right.
to modify the genome of the Asian elephant, which is the mammoth's closest living relative, to incorporate key mammoth traits, particularly those related to cold adaptation.
What specific traits are they targeting for this resurrected mammoth, or mammophant, as some call it? The main focus is on the essential cold adaptations. Things like developing dense, shaggy hair for insulation, incorporating thick layers of subcutaneous fat, maybe altering ear size, and crucially, editing the hemoglobin genes to produce a form of hemoglobin that can release oxygen effectively at cold body temperatures, which mammoths had.
So the goal isn't necessarily to create a perfect, 100% identical mammoth clone.
Not necessarily, and maybe not even possible. It's more about creating a functional equivalent, an Asian elephant engineered to survive, thrive, and hopefully perform the key ecosystem engineering role of the mammoth back onto the cold tundra landscapes, potentially tying into those Pleistocene Park rewilding goals.
The ethical debate surrounding this must be as massive as the animal itself.
Oh, it is huge and incredibly complex. It forces us into a really challenging ethical framework. On one side, you have proponents arguing it's a form of restorative justice,
The argument being,
that humans likely played a significant role in the original extinction. And now that we might have the technological means to undo some of that damage, perhaps we have a moral obligation to try, especially if it helps restore critical ecological functions, like protecting permafrost.
okay, and the other side?
On the other side, many conservationists raise serious ethical and practical concerns, primarily about resource allocation. Can we really justify spending potentially hundreds of millions, maybe billions of dollars to try and resurrect one species of project with uncertain success and unknown ecological consequences?
When that same money could be used to protect countless extents, currently endangered species and their habitats, facing immediate threats right now?
Exactly. Where should our conservation priorities lie? It forces us to ask really fundamental questions about what conservation is or should be in the Anthropocene. Is it about preserving a static snapshot of the present, or should we be actively engineering ecosystems, potentially bringing back elements of a more dynamic, functionally richer past to shape the future? There's no easy answer. Hashtag outro, the final takeaway.
No easy answer at all. But I think the core lesson from this deep dive is pretty clear. The late Quaternary extinction wasn't some simple single-cause event. It was almost certainly a deadly synergistic perfect storm.
Yeah, a combination of factors hitting at once.
And critically, it marks the moment, perhaps more clearly than any other, when Homo sapiens transitioned from being just another localized large mammal population to becoming a truly global geological force, capable of altering planetary-scale processes across every continent simultaneously. The start of the Anthropocene, effectively.
And it forces us to recognize that these large animals, the megafauna, they aren't just charismatic curiosities or a luxury item in the global ecosystem. They're integral functional components. Their highly size-selective loss fundamentally unraveled ecological integrity and resilience worldwide.
And we are still living in that ecologically simplified, arguably impoverished world that they left behind.
We absolutely are. The baseline we consider natural today is already deeply altered by their absence.
So the ghosts of the megafauna really challenge us, don't they? They challenge us to define our future role on this planet. In a world that we have now so thoroughly transformed, should our conservation goals focus solely on preventing further loss, on just holding the line? Or should we consider actively intervening, whether through rewilding with proxies, or maybe even someday through de-extinction? Should we try to restore some of that deep functional richness that has been missing for over 10,000 years? Acknowledging, perhaps, that the world only functions at its fullest potential when the giants walk the earth.
That is the provocative thought, the deep question we leave you with today. What does a truly wild future look like?